What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected legends meets a host who's completely lost touch with reality? You won't believe what unfolds when Harrison Ford sits down for what was supposed to be a routine late-night interview, only to find himself trapped in the most uncomfortable confrontation in television history. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds. Last night's episode of The Late Show started like any other, with Stephen Colbert delivering his opening monologue to the usual applause. But what nobody in that studio audience expected was that they were about to witness one of the most explosive confrontations ever captured on live television. Harrison Ford, the legendary actor known for his no-nonsense attitude and legendary career spanning decades, walked onto that stage with the expectation of promoting his latest project. Instead, he found himself face-to-face with a host who seemed determined to push every single button possible. The trouble began almost immediately after Ford settled into the guest chair. Colbert, wearing that familiar smirk that has become his trademark, launched into what appeared to be standard interview fare. "Harrison, great to have you back on the show," Colbert began, his tone already carrying an edge that regular viewers might recognize as trouble brewing. "I have to ask, at your age, don't you think it's time to maybe step back and let younger actors take on these action roles?" The camera caught Ford's expression shifting almost imperceptibly, his jaw tightening just slightly. Anyone who knows Ford's reputation knows that questioning his ability or suggesting he's past his prime is dangerous territory. "Well, Stephen," Ford replied, his voice measured but with a steel undertone, "I think the audiences and the box office numbers speak for themselves. I'm still here because people want to see the work." But Colbert wasn't backing down. In fact, he seemed emboldened by Ford's restrained response. "Right, but let's be honest here. Isn't there something almost desperate about a man in his 80s still trying to play the action hero? I mean, when does it become less about the craft and more about refusing to accept reality?" The studio audience fell unnaturally quiet. This wasn't the playful banter they were used to seeing. Even the band members seemed to sense something was off, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Ford leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Colbert's face. "Desperate?" he repeated, the word hanging in the air like a challenge. "That's an interesting choice of words coming from someone whose entire career is built on making jokes about other people's work." Colbert's smile faltered for just a moment, but he recovered quickly, leaning forward with renewed aggression. "Hey now, that's what we do here. We have fun, we joke around. But seriously, Harrison, don't you think there's something to be said for knowing when to gracefully exit the stage? I mean, look at your contemporaries who've stepped back from the spotlight." The tension in the room was becoming palpable. Ford's hands, which had been resting casually on the arms of his chair, were now gripped tight enough that his knuckles were beginning to show white. "You know what, Stephen? I've been doing this longer than you've been alive, practically. I've earned the right to make my own decisions about my career without having some talk show host lecture me about grace and timing." "Oh, come on," Colbert shot back, his voice rising slightly. "We're just having a conversation here. But since you brought up experience, let's talk about that. How many of your recent films have actually been worth watching? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're coasting on nostalgia and brand recognition." The audience was now completely silent, the uncomfortable energy in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Ford's legendary composure was being tested in real time, and everyone present could feel the situation spiraling towards something unprecedented. His voice, when he spoke again, was dangerously quiet. "You want to talk about coasting? Let's talk about a comedian who's so desperate for relevance that he has to tear down actual artists to get a reaction from his audience." Colbert's face flushed red, and for the first time since the interview began, he seemed genuinely rattled. "Excuse me? I think you're forgetting where you are right now. This is my show, and I'll conduct my interviews however I see fit. If you Can't handle a few honest questions about your career choices? Maybe you shouldn't be doing publicity tours. The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Ford slowly turned his head to look directly into the main camera, as if addressing the audience at home rather than the man sitting across from him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying that familiar gravitas that had commanded respect for decades. "This is what passes for entertainment these days. A host more interested in creating controversy than having an actual conversation." Colbert's response came swift and sharp. "You know what, Harrison? If you want to sit there and play the victim, that's fine. But don't act like you're above this. You came on this show to sell your movie just like everyone else. The least you could do is answer the questions instead of getting defensive about your legacy." "Defensive?" Ford's voice carried a dangerous edge now. "I'm not being defensive. I'm pointing out that you're being deliberately confrontational for no reason other than to create drama. That's not interviewing, that's just bad television." The studio had become a pressure cooker, with staff members visible at the edges of the frame, looking increasingly concerned. Colbert, perhaps sensing he was losing control of the situation but unwilling to back down, pressed forward with even more aggressive tactics. Bad television? The ratings would suggest otherwise. People tune in to see real conversations, not the sanitized promotional nonsense that passes for interviews everywhere else. Ford stood up slowly from his chair, the movement so deliberate and controlled that it seemed to freeze everyone in the studio. The cameras continued rolling as he looked down at Colbert with unmistakable contempt. "Real conversations? Is that what you call this performance you're putting on?" But just as the confrontation seemed ready to explode into something even more dramatic, Ford paused, his hand on the back of the chair, as if making a decision that would change everything that followed. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, with every person in that studio holding their breath. Ford's eyes never left Colbert's face as he slowly settled back into his chair. But something fundamental had shifted in his demeanor. The restraint was still there, but now it carried the weight of a man who had made up his mind about exactly what kind of person he was dealing with. "You know what, Stephen?" Ford said, his voice taking on a tone that anyone familiar with his film work would recognize as the calm before the storm. "I think I understand what's happening here now." Colbert, perhaps mistaking Ford's return to his seat as a sign of surrender, leaned back with renewed confidence. "Good. Maybe we can get back to having an actual interview instead of this dramatic nonsense." But the smirk on his face suggested he had no intention of changing course. If anything, he seemed emboldened by what he perceived as Ford backing down. "No," Ford said simply, the single word carrying enough weight to stop Colbert mid-gesture as he reached for his note cards. "I don't think you understand at all. You see, I've been in this business long enough to recognize a bully when I see one. And that's exactly what you are, isn't it? You hide behind comedy and claim you're just asking tough questions, but really you're just looking for someone to humiliate for your audience's entertainment." The accusation hung in the air like a live wire. Colbert's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, indignation, and finally settling on something approaching rage. "A bully? Are you kidding me right now? I'm doing my job, which is to ask questions that the audience wants answered. If you can't handle that level of scrutiny, maybe you shouldn't be in the public eye." "Scrutiny?" Ford laughed, but there was no humor in it whatsoever. "Is that what you call deliberately trying to embarrass a guest on your show? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks more like a sad man desperately trying to prove he's relevant by tearing down people who've actually accomplished something." The studio audience was now completely silent, some people visibly uncomfortable in their seats. The camera operators continued filming, but even they seemed uncertain about whether they should keep rolling. Colbert's producers could be seen at the edge of the stage, clearly debating whether to intervene, but the confrontation was unfolding too quickly for anyone to react. Colbert shot to his feet, his chair rolling backward from the force. Accomplished. Something? Let me tell you what I've accomplished, Harrison. I've built a career on holding people accountable, on not just accepting the sanitized version of celebrity that gets spoon-fed to audiences everywhere else. If that makes you uncomfortable, that's your problem, not mine. Ford remained seated, which somehow made his presence even more commanding. Holding people accountable? For what exactly? For continuing to work? For not retiring when you think they should? You're not a journalist, Stephen. You're not even a good comedian anymore. You're just someone who's confused cruelty with courage. Cruelty? Colbert's voice cracked slightly, betraying how deeply the words had hit. You want to talk about cruelty? How about the cruelty of forcing audiences to watch you stumble through action sequences that actors half your age would struggle with? How about the cruelty of taking roles away from younger performers who could actually do them justice? The words seemed to echo through the studio, and for a moment even Colbert appeared to realize he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But Ford's reaction wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of exploding in anger, he began to smile. Not a pleasant smile, but the kind of expression that suggested someone had just revealed exactly who they really were. There it is, Ford said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent studio. There's the real Stephen Colbert, not the fake concern about my career or my legacy, just pure, petty resentment. You're angry because actors like me built something that lasts while you're stuck behind this desk making jokes about other people's work because you can't create anything meaningful yourself. Colbert's face had gone from red to an almost purple shade, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. How dare you sit there and lecture me about meaningful work? I've been on television longer than most of your recent movies have been in theaters. I've won awards. I've influenced political discourse. I've actually made a difference in people's lives. Have you? Ford asked, tilting his head slightly as if genuinely curious. Because from what I can see, all you've done is teach a generation of people that it's acceptable to be cruel as long as you're funny about it. That tearing people down is entertainment. That humiliating guests on your show is somehow a public service. The accusation seemed to hit Colbert like a physical blow. He stepped closer to Ford's chair, his finger pointing accusingly. You don't get to come on my show and psychoanalyze me, old man. You don't know anything about what I do or why I do it. You're just another entitled celebrity who can't handle being asked real questions. Ford finally stood up again, this time with a fluidity that belied his age and seemed to surprise everyone in the room. Standing, he had a presence that filled the space in a way that made Colbert's theatrical posturing look exactly like what it was. Empty performance. Real questions? Is that what you think those were? Because they sounded more like the desperate attention-seeking of someone who knows their time is running out. My time? Colbert laughed harshly. That's rich coming from someone who should have retired a decade ago. At least I'm still relevant. At least people still care about what I have to say. Do they? Ford asked, and the simple question seemed to deflate something in Colbert's stance. Because it seems to me like you have to resort to ambushing guests just to get people talking about your show anymore. When's the last time anyone discussed something you said because it was insightful or funny, rather than because it was mean-spirited? The question hung in the air unanswered, and in that silence, something shifted in the dynamic between the two men. Colbert seemed to realize that he was losing not just the argument, but the respect of everyone watching. His response, when it came, carried the desperation of someone with nothing left to lose. You know what, Harrison? Maybe you're right. Maybe I should just let aging celebrities come on here and tell sanitized stories about their glory days. Maybe I should just smile and nod and help you sell your movie like every other mindless entertainment show. But Ford wasn't finished, and what he said next would ensure that this confrontation would be remembered long after both men were gone. You want to know the difference between us, Stephen? Ford's voice carried a finality that made everyone in the studio understand they were witnessing something unprecedented. I've spent my entire career trying to give audiences something worth their time. You've spent yours teaching them that cruelty is entertainment. And the worst part is, you've convinced yourself that makes you some kind of truth-teller. Colbert's face contorted with rage, all pretense of professional composure completely abandoned. Truth-teller? You're damn right I am. Someone has to call out the BS in this industry, and if that hurts your feelings, then maybe you're not as tough as all those characters you play. My feelings? Ford shook his head slowly, a look of genuine pity crossing his features. Stephen, this isn't about my feelings. This is about your complete lack of professionalism and basic human decency. You invited me here under the pretense of an interview, then spent the entire time trying to humiliate me for your audience's amusement. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the cameras was audible. Even the usually animated audience members sat frozen, sensing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Colbert, perhaps realizing how badly he was losing this exchange, made one final desperate attempt to regain control. Humiliate you? I asked you legitimate questions about your career. If you can't handle honest criticism, then don't come on talk shows. This is what we do here. We have real conversations, not promotional fluff pieces. Ford took a step closer to Colbert's desk, his movement deliberate and commanding. Real conversations? Is that what you call this performance you've been putting on? Because it seems to me like you're more interested in proving how clever you think you are than actually learning anything about your guests. Performance? Colbert's voice reached a pitch that bordered on hysteria. You want to talk about performance? Look in the mirror, Harrison. You've been playing the same character for 40 years. At least I evolve. At least I challenge people. Challenge? People? Ford's laugh was cold and cutting. Stephen, there's nothing challenging about being cruel to guests who can't fight back without looking bad. That's not brave journalism. That's cowardice dressed up as entertainment. The accusation seemed to break something in Colbert. His face went pale, then flushed deep red again. Cowardice? How dare you? I've built my entire career on having the courage to ask the questions nobody else will ask. No, Ford said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded respect for decades. You've built your career on other people's work. You make jokes about actors, politicians, anyone who actually does something with their lives, while you sit safely behind this desk throwing stones. That's not courage, Stephen. That's parasitism. The word parasitism seemed to echo through the studio like a gunshot. Colbert staggered back slightly, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The production staff at the edges of the stage were now openly discussing whether to cut to commercial, but the confrontation was moving too fast for anyone to intervene. Effectively, Ford continued, his voice never rising but somehow filling the entire space. You want to know what really bothers me about this whole thing? It's not the disrespect. I've dealt with that before. It's that you're using your platform to normalize this kind of behavior. You're teaching people that it's acceptable to treat others this way, as long as you can get a laugh out of it. Colbert found his voice again, but it came out as a barely controlled shout. Don't you dare lecture me about my platform. I use this show to hold powerful people accountable. I speak truth to power. Truth to power? Ford's eyebrows raised in genuine surprise. Stephen, I'm an actor. I pretend to be other people for a living. What power do you think you're speaking to? The power to, what, make movies that entertain people? The only power dynamic here is you using your position as host to try to humiliate someone who can't respond in kind without being labeled difficult. The observation seemed to deflate Colbert entirely. For the first time since the interview began, he appeared to truly understand what he had been doing. But instead of backing down, he doubled down with desperate fury. You know what? Fine. Maybe I was trying to get a reaction. Maybe I was pushing buttons. But that's my job. That's what people expect from this show. Ford nodded slowly as if Colbert had just proven his point perfectly. And there it is. The real truth. This was never about asking hard questions or holding anyone accountable. This was about creating a moment for your show, regardless of who got hurt in the process. The studio fell completely silent. Even the production staff had stopped their whispered conversations. Colbert stood behind his desk, breathing heavily, looking like a man who had just realized he had destroyed something he couldn't rebuild. Ford straightened his jacket with deliberate care, every movement conveying dignity and control. "You know, Stephen, I came here tonight to talk about my work, maybe share some stories, give your audience something entertaining. Instead, I got to see exactly what kind of person you really are when the cameras are rolling." "Harrison, wait," Colbert started, his voice suddenly smaller, perhaps finally recognizing the magnitude of what had just transpired. But Ford was already moving toward the edge of the stage. He paused at the steps leading down to the audience, turning back one final time. "For what it's worth, Stephen, you're right about one thing. This will be remembered, but not for the reasons you think." The cameras continued rolling as Ford walked through the studio audience, many of whom began to applaud, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. The sound built until it filled the entire space, a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever while Colbert stood frozen behind his desk. Ford reached the exit and paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright lights of the corridor beyond. Without looking back, he stepped through and disappeared, leaving behind a studio full of people who knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary, the complete dismantling of a host by a guest who refused to be bullied. Colbert remained at his desk, staring at the empty chair where Ford had been sitting, the sound of applause still echoing through the studio. The cameras finally stopped rolling, but the damage was already done. In the span of 20 minutes, Harrison Ford had exposed everything that was wrong with modern late-night television, and he had done it with the kind of quiet dignity that reminded everyone why he had remained a respected figure for so many decades. The audience continued to applaud even as the stage lights dimmed, many of them pulling out their phones to capture the moment. They understood they had witnessed something historic, not just a confrontation, but a masterclass in how to maintain one's integrity in the face of deliberate provocation. And through it all, the empty guest chair remained a silent testament to what happens when professional courtesy finally reaches its breaking point.